Hey there, folks. Welcome to the Crazy Libertarian. You're listening on 88.1 FM. That is KPPP, triple P. The number of P's hasn't in fact changed. LP. That call-in number is 701-566-0917. Once again, 701-566-0917. And something that we've kind of talked about on this show but haven't really addressed yet is kind of the elephant in the room of what's really going on with a lot of issues in this country, and that's public education. But I really don't want to talk about public education in the way that public education always gets talked about. I don't really, and I'm going to bring them up and all that stuff, but I really want to I'm just going to get it out of the way early and get my hypothesis out here. I really think that the way that we talk about and the way that public education is administered in this country is having some very serious negative effects on our youth, and in many sad cases it doesn't contribute, but is also the origin of a lot of the bullying and other psychological issues that kids go through. So the thing that we need to realize when we're talking about bullying or anything like that is that there's no one situation, right? A lot of stuff is contextual. That's what the research says. Who's there, who isn't there, etc. But one thing that we can relatively safely assume in American schools is that bullying is very, very prevalent. Bullying affects 1 in 3 kids between the grades of 6 and 10. This comes from a Business Times article from 2013. And 80% of kids across both genders experience some type of harassment while they're at school. So what we have here is a country and a system that is, like I said, often untalked about, where bullying is not only prevalent, but to a certain extent it's expected, right? Like, if you go home, if you have kids, ask your kids. If you have nieces or nephews, ask them. I guarantee you that it's something that a lot of people don't even think about in terms of going without it. If it's not happening to them, I guarantee you that they know that kid who's on the bottom of the social ladder. Furthermore, they estimate that 160,000 kids a week miss school because of bullying in just a week. When you think about dropout rates, when you think about things like team sports, extracurriculars, things that might help build, self-esteem and things like that, there's clearly a large group of students for who not only is, and here's the thing, can you be a good student while still going through bullying? I'm sure that you can pull it together, but let's not pretend that it doesn't make it harder, right? If you don't have either that, if you're not physically safe, if it's something where you think you're going to get beat up on the way to the bus stop, or even if it's just a social thing, can induce anxiety, a lot of those other things, not to mention that, it's often been said that kids are, 8th graders are in fact the meanest people on this planet. I think John Mulaney said that, and it really kind of shows during this period. Now, it's 75% of school shootings, on a darker note, are tied to, in some ways, to school bullying. 75%. That's one of the larger overlaps in this school shooting debate that's actually consistent across most school shooters. That's an extraordinarily high correlation. And what's kind of interesting, if you will, about that is that 70% of students think that schools don't do enough to prevent bullying, or when it does happen, don't do enough to punish the perpetrator. Speaking a little more personally about I'm sure that this varies depending on the school that you're in, but this also kind of feeds into what is called the school to prison pipeline, right? Man, I wish I could have coined that term. I would be so influential by now. And what we have is we're at this weird nexus because of things that happen, ironically, including Columbine and everything else. We've developed a set of zero tolerance policies in schools, right? A lot of schools, there's been cases where kids have been asked to leave and sent to the principal's office because one kid ate a Pop-Tart in a way that kind of looked like a gun. And it's gotten more nefarious where kids have gone to jail over a snowball fight. I know, and what this does, right, to make this clear, is it undermines that trust in the school system, because what you have is this weird the people that are being bullied are typically the people that hit back second, right? So it happens a lot of the time, and in the experiences that I and other students that I've talked to have had, is that the bullies never, because the bullies get to pick their time and place, people who are being bullied don't. And so what happens oftentimes is if kids stand up for themselves or anything like that, the school administration is either too slow to pick up on the initial bullying, but definitely quick enough to get the kid who, reacted to someone that had been mouthing off to him for months by punching him, acting out, whatever. So what's very clear is that the school system, both socially, is a place for learning, is a place where a lot of kids feel safe, isn't really working. And that school to prison pipeline kicks in other places, because what schools really should be, or at least our idea of them, is that it's supposed to be in this grand utopia that public schools activists like to preach. They pick students up and enable them to overcome whatever, that's why we need them to be government funded, so that they're accessible to all and they can help people. But what happens to kids if they slip up in the public school system? Instead of maybe being talked to by the principal or something mild like we have pictured from, 50 years ago, like I said, it's often handled in a judicial manner. Oftentimes, and there's been a couple of cases where the protocol pretty much is just straight away to call the police. And not only for violent things, not only for fights, there's been, God forbid, you want to talk about something that'll ruin someone's life. It's going to make it really tough to get into a college. The things that you'll get faced with if you're a student that messes up and let's say, brings something prohibited to school, or a student that has an addiction problem or picked up a drinking problem, whatever, and you act up, the first things that schools do is not to reach out and to act in a supportive way and to address the core of the issue. The first thing that schools do, if it's not just to call the police or if it's not just to immediately get people into some type of forced counseling, more on that in a minute, by the way, is to take away things like extracurricular activities, if they're in football, whatever, in school suspension, really isolate them. And that's a very confusing role that the schools are taking on, because as we're kind of discovering, it almost kind of feels a little bit more like a prison at this point. We have police officers in schools, we have threats of shootings, we have to go out in the hallway and pretend that there's someone with a gun that's trying to kill me and my best friends multiple times a semester. This doesn't really feel like something that should be happening in a relatively free society. There was one case, I forget, I will pull it up in the production part, link it for y'all, but there was a case where I believe it was a 5-year-old girl was sent to an involuntary detention for 2 days because she was acting up at school. 2-day psychological hold where she was administered, antipsychotic drugs and things of that nature without the mother's consent, without her knowing, without her being able to see her kid for 2 whole days. And this one was notable because on the video that they obtained, the 2 officers that went to pick this girl up and drive her to I believe it was they picked her up from the school and drove her to the hospital. Like I said, I'll post the video and all that stuff. We're saying yeah, she seemed like she was acting fine, and it seemed like they were pushing her buttons, and and in the video, the kid's acting like a normal, 5-year-old would, right? Very inquisitive, I grew up in a daycare. My mom still does. Did out-of-home daycare for years and years and years. So I know what kids look like when they're not being, I might not be an expert, but I know when there's definitely not a problem. And there was definitely not a problem here. 2-day involuntary hold. So with that, how did this system that's allegedly for education, is this means of mass social uplifting, turn into something where kids are sent to involuntary detention, snowball fights get people with felony records? The first thing that the school does if you get in any kind of trouble, instead of offering support or anything like that, is to cut you off. And yet, not to mention things like school lunch debt, where not only do you have to go here, not only do you have to be there, But if your parents can't afford the lunches that you're feeding you, I mean, some schools will send you to collections. What kind of a system is it where we're forcing kids to be there, forcing them to do all these things, undergo horrific treatment? I mean, and clearly across the board, they feel like they're not being cared about, at least when it comes to things like, I don't know, bullying. Oh, you create a system where if someone fights back, they get a felony record, and then they're not even going to feed them without making sure that they're getting their money first. I mean, obviously, and we'll get to the alternatives in a minute, but there's something wrong here, and there's something that's not about education here. Because if educating a kid is in fact your first goal, you should really be focusing on more than making sure that they sit down, shut up, and pay attention to the lesson plan, right? This really should be more of a holistic picture, especially given everything that the state is doing in the name of our students. So I also want to talk about the growth of the administrative side of education. The Cato Institute is, I believe, attracted from 1970 until 2010, maybe up to 2013, showed that we had about a 200% increase in public education financing and funding since 1970 over a 40-year time frame. Our test scores in every department have continued to plateau since about that time frame across the board. Yeah, some states are doing better than others, but what we've seen is that this mass infusion of cash increasingly has not benefited students. So where has it gone? And the answer increasingly relies in goes to the administrative side of it. And here's where I get to pick on that that weird argument between unions and libertarians that gets from weird to hostile, and they're talking about public unions. Things like pensions, things like tenure, things like I believe that the Cato Institute specifically said that administrative spending is up something like 70% over that time. Just huge across the board increases on that side. And it's become interesting that, and this is something that we see in North Dakota too, right? Where a lot of our debate about public education seems to be, it seems that we kind of frame it in a way like we care more about job security and the economic impacts of having public education in a certain area, or, like in North Dakota where we have universities set up in the state constitution that there needs to be physical universities at various places. That's, Fargo, Grand Forks, Bismarck, there's Minot, a few others. In the state constitution. Now, was that added to make sure that everyone had access to an education, all that stuff? No, it was added as a way that people could get their districts that sweet government money, which is what a lot of it's become, right? It's effectively, a lot of people view it as a jobs program instead of an education program. And not only is that wrong, but that's become so pervasive, and it's clouding our judgment. And indeed, any debate that you have about public education, there's a debate about there's a debate not only about increasing teacher pensions and things of that nature, but there's a debate of how many jobs are there going to be, where are they going to be, if we're going to do something in the name of our children, and apparently we're willing to do a lot to them in the name of this public education thing, right? We're asking them to go through a lot. Can't we at least make them our number one priority? And this doesn't mention some of the underhanded tactics that pension groups have used to increase payouts. Tactics that I forget the exact group, but there's been cases across the country where they will bus in retirees and have them protest in order to get people that are already on the pension plan included in future pension increases. So you have this, really, it's become sort of like I said, it's become more focused on the money going to the teachers than the education going to the students. The students in this system are clearly a second or third in the priority of care, right? And that doesn't work. That being said, though, we do have some alternatives that we've begun to look into as a country that might actually offer us a way out of I mean, calling it a mess would be a really, really, really beneficial statement, right? Because a mess implies that it's like kind of accidental, this nightmare of public education that we've stumbled into. And by the way, that we so very rarely talk about in open and honest terms. So I really, really want to talk about the first thing, which is that homeschooling has gone up a huge degree over the last 40 years. I mean, just since 1990, we've gone from 1997, we've gone from 1 million homeschooled students to up to 2.3 million in 2016. And the median test scores for homeschooled students following organized homeschooling, so, not to call anyone out, but not the unschoolers, people that have some type of a program, typically fare way better, not only in college graduation, but college acceptance rates, to college GPAs, everything, post-graduation. And there's things like charter schools that are being debated for the first time in a while, and a lot of those aren't exactly perfect. We have educational savings accounts. We have a lot of things coming up that are opening up the discourse so that it's more than just public schools. Because that's really what we need to, and honestly, shame on me for using that term, but the name public schools is such a misnomer, because they're not necessarily public schools as we've talked about. They're clearly government schools, because political considerations and government, the government of it, right? The stuff that the progressives tried to eliminate at the turn of the 20th century, is so deeply rooted into it and is in fact the core of what makes up the schooling. But thankfully, these private alternatives are making headway. And something that I really want to talk about is, and something that blows my mind, is the fact that in the 21st century, we are spending so much money and so many students are locked in government schools, despite the fact that we have things like Khan Academy, the internet, tons and tons. And I mean, personally, I did probably half of my college work just on free programs that were online. And that was as a college student. So do we really need to be spending so much money per pupil at actual physical schools? And there comes a certain point about reflexiveness and responsiveness that the government schools just simply haven't been able to react to. And I really don't like using the phrase the industrial school system, because it's it's got a very twisted meaning depending on who you ask. But the fact of the matter is that when we've become to be focused more on government jobs, more on sending students to prison instead of getting them help, and more on where the jobs go and where the buildings are located than what the students are learning, then we clearly need to focus on something other than government coercion, especially in like a prison-style situation, right? I want to focus back in on how much of a prison-style situation we've created. I mean, not only do we have a strictly regimented day. I mean, in some schools you only have a certain amount of bathroom passes per semester, right? Some of those have gone viral. Just a whole bunch but you literally have to be trained for if someone's going to kick in the door and shoot you. However, and that apparently has been our school's response to events like Columbine. We've also started putting police officers, literal cops, in schools, which thus far have proved very not very effective per officer in preventing school shootings. But what they have proved effective in is increasing the school-to-prison pipeline by pumping more and more kids in the prison for minor offenses, right? Whether it be, I don't know, being stupid and having a pack of cigarettes or a Juul or getting in a stupid schoolboy argument, whatever it may be, we've clearly succumbed to other issues other than the well-being of the student. And the fact that we've turned it into a literal prison without so much as blinking an eye to it should really tell us a lot about the state of our public education system, and should really tell us that if nothing else, and the alternatives that we'll get into in a minute here, it's shown is that the current system just isn't working. I really, really would like anyone to challenge me on how exactly. And here's the other horrible thing about our public education system, right? Is that even if it's working in some areas, it's totally because of how it's funded. It's largely dependent on where you live, especially if you're poor, especially if you live in a urban community or if you don't have access to be able to drive your kid an hour, hour and a half, or arrange transportation, whatever it may be. You're stuck in these schools. So it's kind of unfair because the schools that are doing the worst often are made up of people that are at least able to, under the current system, get out and actually go into better schools. So not only are we dragging it down across the board, but in those schools that are doing the worst, they're not only getting less, but those people have the least resources, which is the exact opposite of most of the arguments made in favor of this type of government schooling. So I just want to close with this awesome song of the day that we'll get to in a second, but I just really want to close with the fact that instead of building a ladder to lift students up, we've effectively built a wall to keep them in. And that doesn't sound like the type of country that we want. And furthermore, it doesn't sound like we're producing a system where people are used to things like freedom, making their own choices, and having to deal with, I don't know, daily events without being hyper-regimented to the core until they're 18. And building a wall around students just hasn't worked. So I'll leave you there. I'll be back in a second. Hey there, we are back. Hope you like that little bit of music for you. So I want to kind of talk about some of the alternatives and what they really mean, and to a larger extent, what we're hoping to get out of education in the first place. So the big thing, kind of the misunderstood, it's an angel to the right, kind of to libertarians and demonized by the left largely, are charter schools. Essentially, they're private schools that don't have to deal with as many of the regulations as a public school do, and they get way more autonomy in how they run their school, to a certain extent their curriculum, how they organize their day, teacher contracts, all of that stuff. So there's a lot of, it can be wholly different, like totally different than a normal public school. But in exchange for that autonomy and extra levels of freedom, they have to deal with way more accountability in terms of test scores, in terms of student outcomes, things like that. Now, I really want to focus in on that accountability part because I think that's part of what this conversation is missing. And this is going to be a real hot take to some of you, but what we need to do is bring the market back into the realm of education. We've separated it out, and what we've done is we haven't allowed the costs that taxpayers are paying to really be able to effectively be viewed as in exchange for what each student is doing. So charter schools are kind of an attempt to remedy that and to bring some of that in action, because in exchange for their different way of doing business, they have to hit a higher standard, which is a good first step. So I want to talk about just the stunning growth that they've had, right? Which is really confusing as to why there's not more options or why it's not better understood, because where it's had success, it's been a very murmured success. Now, the first one actually opened up in St. Paul in 1992, which is kind of surprising, but, you know, given what we've learned about St. Paul and Minneapolis in the last 10 years, but that was the first one in 1992, and since then, as of 2014, we had almost 3 million students attend charter schools in this country. So over just a 22-year time frame, we had, you know, from 1 to to almost 3 million students. Ridiculous growth. And yet they're so misunderstood and so demonized. I also want to mention that they've really seen some rapid growth, especially in the early part of the decade. They grew 62% from 2010 to 2015 alone, which shows that there is where there are options, people are taking advantage of them, right? And what I want to focus in on charter schools, because the problem with charter schools is that it's to a certain extent like the problems in public schools. Whenever there's a bad charter school, and there are going to be bad charter schools, people on the left and proponents of government education say that all charter schools are like that when there's a really A+ one. People on the right and big proponents of it say that all of them are like that, just like they do with government schools on the left. So really, the point that needs to be made here is that we're introducing the market back into it, right? The point is not that every charter school is going to be phenomenal, nor that every public school is awful. I don't want to sit here and imply that, teachers aren't doing their jobs and that they're just awful all around. And I've had some amazing teachers at my public schools, but what they offer that public schools never can is that element of choice, and it's that students don't have to be stuck at a bad charter school for 4 years. They don't have to be limited based off their area code, right? That's really the big thing that often gets missed in this debate, is how many students are unfairly trapped in schools that just don't work. And you know what? It is unfair because the schools that already, and the communities that already have those issues at hand, don't get the funding and the other accolades that better performing schools do. And it's like a vicious cycle, right? So the point of these charter schools is that they're like the first step out. Are they perfect? Is it the end-all be-all? Not necessarily. But they're giving a chance for the market to kind of put its way just very so slightly back into the realm of education, and giving people a way to actually identify where they would get more bang for their buck and where their students would be able to get a better education. So I also want to talk about some of the other things that are they overlap with it. It's not always, just because, for example, you pay for a school with a voucher doesn't mean it's a charter school, blah, blah, blah. But I really want to kind of identify some of this terminology. So there are vouchers, which is money that states give to parents of students that aren't in public education to spend on education. So if you take your kids out and it varies state by state, but a hypothetical example of a voucher would be you take your kids out, and instead of, let's say for a semester of not being in public school, the state gives you $2,000, which you can only spend on a approved school, whether it be a charter school, private school, or whatever the case may be. So that's what a voucher is, just money specifically for education. There are also educational savings accounts, which is probably in the realm of where we're going with this. I think that this is the solution that gives the most power to parents based off of the policy options out there today. And very simply, an educational savings account is money given specifically to a parent for their kid to attend charter or to attend private schools. It varies a little bit from a voucher in that it's not per se a set amount of money. In educational savings accounts, the big things is that they're put in a debit card or a savings account specifically for that means. So essentially what it allows parents to do is it allows them to have, instead of just putting their money directly to the public school, it allows them to be able to use that as a vehicle for whatever they think is the most appropriate. And of course there's tax benefits and all that, or it's the money that they spend doesn't count towards income, all of that good stuff. So I think that that's the best one. And educational savings accounts typically have a little bit more flexibility than vouchers, but like I said, a lot of this varies, and a lot of it does come down to the regulations and stuff that states and localities put on it. But the point is, these programs, to a certain extent, some iterations better than others, offer parents a choice in their education. There's also tax credits, which me and Duke have been talking about here. Who is Duke? Some of you might know. But we were talking about tax credits, and that's money that's when after you spend it, you get money back when you file your taxes for the money that you've spent on education, which is great, of course, if you have the money to spend in the first place. But that's another avenue that, although to a, certainly a lesser extent than would be with the other systems, gives parents a choice and a little bit more of an option. So I also kind of want to delve into some of the things that aren't really talked about, and that's apprenticeships or work options, because it seems like we've really, in this whole education debate, what we've kind of forgot is how to produce well-rounded adults, right? It really seems like a lot of people come out of high school not only not knowing how to, I don't know, do their taxes, how to even go about doing their taxes, how to, I don't know, change a car tire, how to do a bunch of things that you might need to do just to function, right? And so what apprenticeships and work options give students the option to do is not only to like learn skills that would be marketable, but to a certain extent, they allow themselves to be their own entrepreneurs and to be innovators of themselves, right? Because when you give someone under the age of 18 the opportunity to go, you know, if they're naturally mechanically inclined, I don't see why you wouldn't want to have them do an apprenticeship based around something that they love to do, where they can maybe make money for doing it, and then supplement everything else around that. It seems like we've gotten so, we've lost the outcome of education to the journey of education, it feels like. It feels like people are so focused on the way that we've always done things that we really end up stifling growth. And this is something, when I say apprenticeships, especially for people under the age of 18, the first thing that like pops into people's minds is these horrible visions of, you know, oh my gosh, like child labor and sweatshops and all that other stuff. But the big thing to note here is that not only have things changed way remarkably for a whole bunch of reasons, but we are not really giving children a whole lot of anything with a lot of the public schools that of the government schools that we're leaving them with. And even the schools that do very well, that get kids placed in the colleges, etc., I'm willing to bet that there's a lot of students that once they graduate don't really know a whole lot about, I mean, for lack of a better term, life. One of the first things to be cut are programs like FACS or like a shop class, alternatives, right? Unfortunately, it's these very specialized alternatives where not only can you make the most money, but where you can actually figure out how to make yourself a marketable individual. Because I know a whole lot about the U.S. history. I could sit and talk with you about it for 5 or 6 hours, but so far that hasn't needed to be shown on my resume, and I doubt that it ever will be. And there's kind of a problem with that. And I also want to kind of mention here, when we're talking about these apprenticeships, that this is one of those things where I will go out of my way and praise a European system, but this is one of the things that Germany has done very well, right? And I think they've done it in a very blunt way. I think that their form of corporatism is really bad, and I wouldn't want that here. But they have been good in that they allow kids under the age of 18 to start thinking about what career they might want, and then, you know, start molding themselves into the people that they want to be. Now, obviously, in my system, you know, the German system is state-run and very top-down regimented, all that. But they do get it right in that, to a certain extent, kids know what they want to do. You know, kids have natural interests in things, and shoving a square hole in a round peg doesn't do anyone any good. Giving people the option to grow and gain marketable skills while also figuring out what the hell they want to do with their lives, that could be an asset. And the thing that I really want to focus on here is that, you know, there's a lot of school choice as an umbrella term, has a lot of things involved with it, right? There's a lot of different ways that you can go about this. There's, you know, different states have done it in different ways. Whole lot of thought and theory about how to go about this. I really want to be clear that I'm not trying to come out here and like say that this is the way that we should do our education system, or pick a winner, or claim to be the end-all be-all. What I really want to kind of make apparent, what's not talked about, is how the current system fails to do so many of the things that we pay very good money in order for it to do. And if the school system is really having such atrocious problems, why, by and large, are students still stuck with going to school based on where their zip code is? This just doesn't make sense, and even if all the alternatives aren't perfect, we need to at least start discussing them as a society. Because if we want to solve some of the problems that are troubling not only our workforce, not only our youth psychologically, not only, you know, the problems that we're having competing internationally, all of that stuff, a lot of it really comes down to these formative years. And if we know that a lot of what we're doing just isn't working, then why do we continue to dump money on it? And why haven't we looked for an alternative? And that's the question that I'll leave in your minds. And I want to kind of go on one more little bit of, and I know that I've talked about the Orange Man a lot on this show. Don't mistake it for respect. It's just that he does a lot of very different things, right? And one of the different things that he's done is he's got behind the Educational Freedom Scholarship and Opportunity Act, which, and yes, I'm going to praise him, is actually a very good reform. It's a great first step. It's an act that puts public funds so that students can use them for a certain set of private schools. It essentially opens up funding mechanisms for things other than government schools, which is an excellent step. It allows more school choice to low-income families, all of that good stuff. But it's certainly not enough, because like I said, the larger discussion that we need to be having needs to go beyond that. Because if we're not focusing on the education of our children, then why are we going through this farce of calling it a public education system in the first place? And fortunately, we have seen reforms, but the larger question kind of seems to be missed in all of the partisan fighting. So what I really want to close on here is, if our students aren't learning, then maybe we need to ask the hard questions in order to make sure that we can actually learn something. Because the bigger point, America, and what I want to leave you on is this. If our students aren't learning at the moment, then the parents and the people of this country, the taxpayers of this country, no less, need to start asking and start educating themselves to see how we can get ourselves out of this mess. Because like I said, if these students aren't learning, then we might as well not have the system at all. This has been the Crazy Libertarian. Hey there, this is the end of your favorite weekly drive to work show, the Crazy Libertarian. So I want to close with this. I know that I've been talking a lot of smack about education today and the public school system and all that, but I can't help but forget that there are in fact some good things about the public and some positive things about the public education system. It is that it is just for literally all of the wrong reasons. So with that line of thinking, I'm going to leave you off with Smoking in the Boys Room. You have an awesome rest of your day.